There is one prophecy in the Bible that has unsettled believers, fascinated skeptics, and sparked intense debate for generations. A prophecy so strange that for centuries, many people could not imagine how it could ever become possible. It sounded too futuristic, too impractical, too impossible to happen in the real world. And yet, today, millions are beginning to ask a deeply uncomfortable question. What once seemed impossible now feels disturbingly imaginable. The Bible describes a future system so integrated into daily life that participation in the economy itself becomes conditional. Buying, selling, access, commerce, basic transactions, all linked to a form of compliance. For centuries, this raised a problem. How could such a system ever exist on a global scale? How could economic participation be monitored broadly enough to enforce something so comprehensive? How could billions of people be tracked, authenticated, and regulated in practical ways? And now, for the first time in human history, those questions no longer sound theoretical. Stay until the end, because the final connection we will explore may completely change how you think about technology, economics, identity, and biblical prophecy. Before we begin, if you are passionate about biblical prophecy, end times analysis, and understanding world events through Scripture, subscribe now. This channel explores prophecy, spiritual realities, and hidden biblical patterns behind modern headlines. And the upcoming videos will go even deeper into some of the most mysterious and debated end times topics in Scripture. Subscribe now and become part of a growing community committed to staying spiritually awake. Now let's begin with the text that started this global conversation. In Revelation 13, 16, 17, we read, "It also forced all people, great and small, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark, so that they could not buy or sell unless they had the mark." Pause and think about how extraordinary that statement is. This is not merely a religious symbol. The text explicitly connects this system to economic participation, buying and selling, commerce, access, transactions. For most of history, enforcing this seemed implausible. Human societies were too fragmented, economies were too localized, verification systems were too limited. Tracking compliance at meaningful scale would have been extraordinarily difficult, but technology changes what is possible. And possibility changes how prophecy is perceived. This is what makes the Mark of the Beast conversation so relevant today. Not because one can definitively identify any current technology as fulfillment, that would be irresponsible, but because the infrastructure that once seemed unimaginable is no longer unimaginable, and that is a significant shift. Now let's be clear, the book of Revelation is highly symbolic and widely debated. Serious Christians disagree on interpretive frameworks, literal, symbolic, hybrid, sequential, cyclical. Responsible discussion requires humility. But humility does not mean ignoring what the text plainly says. There is an economic dimension. That much is difficult to deny. And that economic dimension naturally raises important modern questions. What kinds of systems could make large-scale transaction control more feasible than ever before? Think about how rapidly the world has changed. Physical cash usage is declining in many parts of the world. Digital payment ecosystems continue expanding. Identity systems are becoming increasingly digitized. Authentication technologies are becoming more sophisticated. Biometric verification is growing. Facial recognition capabilities are advancing. Financial systems are becoming more integrated. Again, none of this proves prophetic fulfillment. Technology is not prophecy by default. That distinction matters. But technological capability changes what humans can implement. And Scripture becomes easier to imagine when implementation barriers shrink. That is what many people find so striking. For centuries, people struggled to conceptualize the logistics. Today, logistics are far easier to imagine. Now ask yourself honestly, how much of modern life is already mediated by systems? Access to money, access to communication, access to identity verification, access to services, access to platforms. Increasingly, participation depends on credentials, permissions, and compliance structures. This is simply modern reality. And while these systems can offer convenience and security, they also raise obvious philosophical questions. What happens when access becomes increasingly centralized? What happens when economic participation becomes more conditional? What happens when identity, finance, and behavioral systems become more integrated? These are not purely prophetic questions. They are civilizational questions. Now here is what makes Revelation 13 particularly interesting. The passage does not merely describe economic restriction, it also describes allegiance. This suggests something deeper than technology. The mark is not merely about mechanics, it is connected to worship, loyalty, and identity. That is critical. Many conversations reduce this topic to gadgets, implants, or payment systems alone, but the biblical framework appears larger. Technology may be part of implementation possibilities, but the deeper issue is allegiance, compliance, identification with a system. That changes the conversation, because prophecy is rarely only technological. It is moral, spiritual, political, psychological, and that is what makes this topic far more profound than many assume. Now think about how crisis changes human behavior. During stable periods, populations tend to resist intrusive systems more strongly. But during instability, psychology shifts. Fear changes priorities. Convenience becomes more valuable. Security becomes more urgent. Risk tolerance changes. People become more willing to accept systems previously considered excessive if those systems appear to solve urgent problems. History repeatedly demonstrates this. Crisis accelerates adoption. This is one reason prophecy watchers pay such close attention to global instability. Wars, economic uncertainty, cyber threats, financial disruptions, identity fraud, security risks. These all create environments where integrated systems become easier to justify. Again, this is not conspiracy. It is simply institutional logic. Problems generate solutions. Solutions reshape norms. Norms redefine what is considered acceptable. This is how societies evolve, and it is why the mark of the beast discussion feels increasingly relevant, not because the system must already be here, but because the world feels more structurally capable of supporting something analogous than ever before. Now let's discuss money. For centuries, cash created friction against centralized oversight. Physical exchange is decentralized by nature. But digital systems behave differently. Digital systems increase efficiency, traceability, programmability, and integration potential. This changes the nature of economic control. Transactions can become more visible. Conditions can become more enforceable. Systems can become more coordinated. Again, these features are not inherently evil. Technology is a tool, but tools alter capability, and altered capability affects how prophetic scenarios are interpreted. This is the key distinction. Many people make one of two errors. Some dismiss prophecy entirely because they assume ancient texts cannot meaningfully intersect with modern systems. Others recklessly declare every innovation fulfillment. Both extremes are unhelpful. A wiser approach is sober observation, not panic, not dismissal. Observation. What conditions are becoming increasingly plausible? What capabilities now exist that previous generations lacked? What patterns align conceptually with biblical warnings? These are reasonable questions, and they deserve thoughtful engagement. Now here is another layer many overlook. The mark of the beast is often discussed as though its primary significance is practical inconvenience, but Revelation frames it as spiritually consequential. This means the deeper issue is not merely transaction restriction, it is participation in a broader system of distorted allegiance. This is why the topic remains so powerful. It touches something fundamental: freedom, identity, authority, worship, trust, dependency. These are profound human questions, and in a world increasingly mediated by systems, these questions become even more urgent. Now let's return to the psychological dimension. Why would populations accept increasingly integrated systems? Again, because systems solve problems. Friction decreases, convenience increases, security improves. Adoption becomes normalized gradually, rarely through sudden force alone. This matters. The most transformative systems in history often succeed not simply because they are imposed, but because they are embraced. Useful systems spread quickly. This is why prophecy discussions about the future cannot be reduced to simplistic coercion narratives. Human beings often cooperate willingly with systems they perceive as beneficial. That is more realistic and more sobering. Now consider Jesus' repeated warnings about deception. In prophetic contexts, deception is central. Why? Because danger does not always appear dangerous. This principle applies here as well. The greatest shifts are often normalized incrementally. One step, then another, until what once felt extraordinary feels ordinary. This is how social adaptation works. And prophecy awareness helps people remain attentive to trajectory, not merely isolated events. That is why this conversation matters, not because one should live in paranoia, but because passivity is not wisdom. Biblical watchfulness involves discernment, attention, seriousness. In Matthew 24:42, Jesus says, "Keep watch, not panic. Watch, discern, remain grounded." This is the appropriate posture. And grounding matters because prophecy content can easily become emotionally overwhelming when detached from larger biblical perspective. The larger perspective is essential. Scripture does not merely warn, it also anchors. Psalm 46 says, "God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in trouble." Again, notice the framing, not protection from all turbulence, but refuge within turbulence. This is what gives prophetic awareness meaning beyond fear. Now let me ask you something. If the world is becoming more digitally integrated, if economic participation is becoming increasingly system-dependent, if identity and finance are becoming more technologically intertwined, if Revelation describes future economic restrictions linked to allegiance, should this not at least provoke reflection? Not hysteria. Reflection. Because whether one sees these systems as purely practical, prophetically relevant, or both, one truth is clear. The world is changing rapidly, faster than many people emotionally process, and rapid change often obscures long-term implications. That is why perspective matters. That is why discernment matters. That is why Scripture continues to fascinate people across centuries. It offers frameworks for examining human systems not merely at technical level, but moral and spiritual level. So what happens next? Will future crises accelerate system integration even further? Will economic infrastructure become increasingly centralized? Will technological convenience make deeper dependence feel natural? These remain open questions, but they are no longer abstract, and that is precisely why so many people are paying attention. Now I want to hear from you. Do you believe the world is moving towards systems that make revelation easier to imagine than ever before? What developments do you think are most relevant? Comment below. I read the comments, and some of the best conversations on this channel happen there. And if this video gave you a new perspective on biblical prophecy and the future, subscribe now. Because in the next video, we will explore one of the most mysterious figures in prophecy, the false prophet, how deception and spiritual influence may shape the final system, and why many believe the world is becoming more vulnerable to mass deception than ever before. You do not want to miss that. Subscribe now, stay discerning, and remember, the systems that reshape history rarely look threatening when they first appear.